The Canadian Museum Association has released a report they say marks the beginning of a new era for the advancement of truth and reconciliation in museums. They're encouraging members to increase Indigenous voices, perspectives, and engagement at every level of museum operations across the country. The report is aimed at advancing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action number 67, which calls upon the federal government to provide funding to the CMA to develop a national review of museum policies and best practices with input from Indigenous peoples.
A national review of this type and scope hasn't happened in about 30 years.
Heather George, president of the CMA, says museums have a deep legacy of colonization and relationships need to be repaired. George says this report highlights the importance of self-determination of Indigenous peoples in the museum space. The report also talks about the need to return artifacts and cultural belongings currently in museums which were not ethically acquired. George says there could be millions of artifacts requiring repatriation.
And that's because the material is very diverse, right? So it can be anything from a small pottery shard to, a headdress, or even archival records that carry our stories and our terminology, our language, right?
Our people have always lived on what we call Turtle Island.
I think all museums have a role to play in furthering reconciliation.
Aisha Khan, CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, says museums of every size and type have a role to play at every level in moving the needle of reconciliation forward. The report also calls for museums to adopt meaningful Indigenous governance with decision-making authority over how Indigenous exhibits and stories are shared.
And whereas before we might have been consulting, doing a bunch of work, and hey, how does this feel to you? It's now about sharing our authority, giving Indigenous people the right to govern themselves, to direct how they want their own stories to be told.
Manitoba Museum CEO Dorota Blumchenskia says she was excited by the report and is looking into how the Manitoba Museum can deepen their efforts of reconciliation for generations to come.
How do we ensure that they are enduring and that they survive all of us? All our efforts and all of our relationships must survive all of us. When we are gone, this good work has to continue.
In Winnipeg, Mark Neufeld, City News.
Next on City